So, hi everyone. Thanks for joining our chat on the challenges of API Sprawl. So, feel free to ask questions in the chat. So, we really want to make this session very interactive. So, we're very excited to see that some people already asked questions beforehand. I guess maybe they were not able to join. So, just let us know where you're joining us from, and we're just going to dive right in the conversation. So we're all here together. So I'm Alexandra. I'm just going to be moderating the conversation between Antoine, Erik, and Bill. So all our API sprawl experts in the house. So I think I'll firstly let all of you present yourself. So Bill, you joined first. You can go first. Just
Okay.
tell.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm an editor for a blog called Nordic APIs, and I'm following a lot of stuff in the API economy. I've written some articles about API sprawl, which probably prompted these people to ask me to join this event.
Yes.
And I'm a tech journalist. I submit to some other presences as well. I'm excited to explore this subject. I think there's a lot of different angles to consider here and preventative measures to kind of talk about to avoid API sprawl. So yeah, excited to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. So, Erik, I guess you could go first and explain why you wrote API Whisperer under your title.
see, because it's a good conversation starter. No, I do that now at conferences. I'm actually at a conference in London, so here's my badge, and it's always nice, when people look at your badge and it says API Whisperer. It's a good way to start a conversation. So yeah, hello everybody. I'm Erik Wilde. Thanks for organizing this. So I've been working in the API space for a long time. I've written books about it, articles. I work for companies as mostly an evangelist, you might say. I have a YouTube channel that's called Getting APIs to Work. Check it out. And I just talk to people about APIs. My interest always is to how to get the most out of your investments in the API space, right? And there are some things that are very technical. There are other things that are oftentimes for people surprisingly non-technical. And I'm a tech person in terms of my background, but I really find it interesting to find out how do people make the most out of APIs, and I try to do that by whispering into their ears what they should think about.
Nice. And then up to you, Antoine.
Hi, hello everyone. So I'm Antoine, the co-founder and CTO of Escape. I'm glad to be here today to introduce you a little bit of research we conducted with the team at Escape. Twice a year at Escape, we like working on research topics, and the latest one was about API secrets, tokens, sprawling in front ends. So I'm glad to be here to discuss that topic, and I'm glad to see you again, Bill. It was great being with you in Sweden a few months ago. So hope to see you this year too. And nice to meet you, Erik.
Yeah, I'm still up to see both of you because I don't think I've met both of you in real life yet. I don't know. Maybe one time in Europe. But yeah, Bill, you were right that one of the reasons I proposed to join this panel is because I've read a lot of your articles about API sprawl and where you mentioned it's the pressing concern specifically in 2024. And I think the first questions, that I had, why 2024? Because that's the kind of the topic that what people already talked before a little bit. So yeah, why now?
Yeah, why not, right? Well, it might not be the most pressing concern for every organization, granted. I think specifically, I'm talking about the ones that are probably more likely advanced in their digital strategies. They've been developing and consuming APIs for a number of years, and maybe in large environments, you might have acquired other companies or developers have left. And you get to this point where it might be a little bit challenging to track all the integrations you have with third parties and the APIs that are being internally developed too. So that's one aspect. I think it's relevant right now. Another is just like we have a lot of disparate API styles to contend with right now, from REST to GraphQL, gRPC, and so on. So consistency isn't always super standardized across an organization, and we might have inconsistent styles even for the same design paradigm for APIs. A lot of what I've been talking about has been informed by like, people at Escape doing these sort of studies. And the fact that you found 18,000 API related secrets and tokens out there just left exposed kind of to me indicates that we might have some potential sprawl issues out there. Other reports are talking about how 10% of organizations fully document their APIs. That was from an EMA study that I found last year. And this F5 report in 2021 estimated we're approaching about 200 million public and private APIs out there. So I think just the sheer increase in APIs means that we have to think more about how they're being utilized, how we're governing them, and what are the long-term ramifications of not properly addressing this portfolio of APIs that just seems to be expanding. That's kind of some high-level thoughts.
Okay. And do you agree, Erik, that it's, do you agree actually with Bill on that?
Well, I think we've had our discussions, Bill, right? I mean, yes. I mean, generally speaking, right? I think the trend is very clear that the API space is constantly evolving and growing, right? Like there are just more and more APIs out there because we just digitalize more and more things. We create more and more services, and that is like almost naturally leads to the fact that there are just more APIs out there. And to some extent, I mean, organizations put a lot of effort into making sure that happens, right? They want to create more digital services, mobile apps, integrations with other companies. So all the kinds of things that are just based on APIs. So in the end, I mean, the term API sprawl has been around for a long time, right? And I kind of never liked it that much because it definitely has negative connotations, and that's intentional. And I yes, there are negative side effects, right? And just recently, Software AG actually published a report where they now talk about API chaos, right? Like even more alarming, and like I agree to the things that they find, right? I mean, their findings, I would say, are valid. I just wouldn't frame it that way. I would just say, you know what? Like if you do DevOps and team topologies and agile development and you enable everybody to create stuff in your organization, well, you just get more stuff, right? You just have to deal with it. And in my mind, that's more the aspect that I'm interested in, not so much the sprawl itself, but do we evolve our management practices in the right way to actually deal with that? And yes, there are some points to be made that we do not, right? Like those findings that there are a lot of leaked secrets out there, where basically some team in some company, right, just does something without ever asking anybody, just like they just use GitHub, right, and say, it's gonna be fine, and then it's not fine, right? So, and that just means that we probably have to be better in our practices. But I think it's mostly just showing that we have a scaling problem. I don't think that the problem is so much that we have too many APIs. I think is that our governance and management practices haven't quite caught up. So that to me is more the issue that I think is the pressing one. And when I hear terms such as sprawl and chaos, right, it's like, to me, it's more like this idea of, there are too many of them. And I think like, well, that's what you wanted. So let's see how we manage that. So that's my point. But yeah, generally speaking, I agree. We have many APIs, but that's good.
Yeah, and why do you think like that's good? I think that was the difference, between your two opinions, because you said, yeah, that's good, and I think Bill said it's more like challenging. So why do you?
It's both.
Okay. So you can't pick one.
I think there's some semantics there, and it depends on how you define the word sprawl. Technology sprawl has been used in discussions for years. Technical debt, I think, is similarly discussed in that, the view is like, yeah, as technology progresses, we're going to accumulate more technical debt. Like what Erik's saying, it's how it's managed that matters. And what Erik said about API governance not being in an evolved state to scale to the conditions that we're in right now. I think that is introducing the sprawl effects that I've been discussing in my articles, like, lack of reuse, poor service discoverability, lack of consistency, and potentially bad developer experiences. And it could cause things like shadow IT and interfaces that people don't realize are still active and should have been shuttered a long time ago. It's kind of a part of a lack of documentation and improper inventorizing of these services. So all that kind of falls under the scope of governance, which might not be as evolved to deal with the amount of APIs out there right now.
And do you think it's something that's gonna improve within the next 3-4 years? Because I think, Erik, your first videos, on this topic are dated 2021. So we're 2024 and we still have the problem. So I guess, is it 2027, is it gonna change? Or what do you think is stopping it, from actually improving?
I mean, I think it is improving. So at least what we see is that, for example, Gartner now starts, and when Gartner says things, right, that's the truth. So Gartner now starts talking about federated API management, right? So they have also noticed that organizations now are moving away from this older model of everything needs to be centralized, and then anything that's not centralized becomes the shadow stuff around, right? And now it's a more inclusive view trying to say, well, centralizing everything is probably not a good idea anyway. So let's think about how we do it in a more decentralized way, but still with some kind of centralized governance and insights into what happens. And I think we do see that the market changes, that the focus changes. It's always going to be some kind of problem, I think. With sometimes it's just a people. I don't want to say people problem because that sounds too negative, but it's more a social and cultural problem, right? It's like if you have a team that just starts using GitHub to upload stuff because they are playing around with it, you just need to probably explain better in your organization that, hey, this is relevant data and relevant stuff. You cannot just use public platforms to do that, right? So, and I think that is changing. So it's not going to be perfectly solved, but I do think that at least now it has entered more of a mainstream. So I would assume that at least in the next couple of years we do make some progress, but I don't assume it's going to completely be solved, which is great because that's job security for me.
Yeah, Erik, I just wanted to piggyback on something you said about APIs becoming kind of more of a household name in a way. At least there's more awareness on them now, and I see more executives understanding the challenges associated with them, as opposed to you and I have been doing this for a long time. Like that platform summit where we initially met in 2017 or 2016, not as many people were talking about this, and definitely leadership was not aware. The argument back then was how do we encourage our leadership to embrace an API first strategy? Now, I think maybe we're on alignment here. It's the industry is now shifting to, okay, how do we manage the API first strategy correctly? So people are more aware, and also maybe more interested in investing in API governance as a concept, as opposed to just being a tool, because these kind of guardrails and policies and frameworks are sort of greater than a single management platform. I think the two are kind of separate ideas, but we could dive into more about like how to actually implement this kind of stuff. I think that's a different conversation.
Yeah,
But
I
it's a
think like the
term that
API.
definitely pops up a lot. I mean, right,
Yeah.
as I said, I'm at a conference here, right, in London, API conference, and there's a lot of talk about governance, right? So you hear that term a lot. So it definitely has arrived, I would say, in the conscience of people that, yeah, that's probably something we need to do. So that, at least I think that's good news.
Yeah, but I think even now when we speak, I speak, on a podcast over our customers, I think it's governance is definitely the term that's being used like quite a lot, and actually on the events as well. Like that's something that's been but it depends, I would say, on the level, of the person within the company. I would say it's more kind of a headache for like IT governance managers or like CISOs. Versus I think the engineers or like application security managers, they don't yet not yet all of them think about it as a pressing concern, I would say. And do you have like an opinion how you would justify it, as a pressing concern within an organization, because you have like so many, fires everywhere all the time, and how would you actually, do you think people would, how would you make someone, prioritize that?
Erik, do you want to?
I would, yeah. So I think one of the things that we don't see this much so far, I would say, is like a little bit more grown-up way of basically digital supply chain management, right? Thinking about what are the practices that I have in the API space, in the software development space. What do these practices have in terms of consequences? Like, what are the risks that I'm introducing? What are the side effects that I'm having? What are the dependencies what I'm having? How do I manage those, right? So in many cases, I think that's still something that is not really managed very with a lot of urgency, right? It just happens like, well, that team decided to use that service and that team decided to use that service, right? And at least, living in Europe, one of the things that happens increasingly is just that regulation changes that, right? Because when regulation comes in, suddenly you sometimes get like huge fines if you have data leakage, you don't store data of people in the right place, right? So, and that's something where suddenly like risk and compliance people come in who have in itself not much to do with APIs and IT, right? But they are basically trying to shield companies from huge risks in terms of financials.
Yeah.
And then it becomes really something where, it's not just like, wouldn't it be nice if, it's really like, hey, if we don't do this, right, like we need to pay this huge fine and we really need to make sure this doesn't happen. So I think there are more and more of these forcing functions coming in as well. And I mean, there's some regulation in the US as well, right? So when it comes to certain like financial data and health related data, right? So, and I think we will see more and more of that. And that I think will become more and more of a forcing function where it's just not so much in terms of good software engineering, just in terms of, we need to make sure we don't expose the company to too much risk, right? Just that.
Yeah. I completely agree. And I think the security angle is one way to make the argument for investing in API governance to potentially reduce the sprawl effects, if we want to use that term. Just documenting things thoroughly, having a comprehensive overview of your catalog of internal APIs, third-party APIs, partner APIs, just to make sure that like you're tracking the life cycles of all of these services, and to ensure that nothing is, like I said earlier, left public when it shouldn't be, perhaps. Just having more awareness over that portfolio, I think, is a step one toward ensuring that they aren't attacked, because you can't secure what you don't know about, right? That's kind of the main cybersecurity doctrine that everyone says. I think perhaps the second most important factor here to consider, and maybe would help make the argument, is I think the impact on developer experience. Because if there is more awareness of a service portfolio, you can encourage more use of those APIs, those services, kind of to increase the API first culture within an organization. And if there is more governance around these interfaces, then you're probably making more consistent style decisions from service to service, developers are more comfortable about how to integrate things. Someone at one of our conferences called this the similar hallways approach, which I kind of like the idea of, you're in a developer portal at the same company, and it looks similar no matter which services you're trying to integrate with. You have like a similar authentication authorization flow. You know where the documentation lies, and it's easy to go through, and there's a good experience for all of that. So governance that considers developer experience and improves it, I think, can have, at the end of the day, not only security benefits, but reduce cost benefits, because we've seen a lot of studies and theories out there on how developer experience reduces cost for the organization and improves employee satisfaction, reduces churn. So there's a lot of benefits, I think, on the employee satisfaction side of kind of reining in an API portfolio.
Yeah, I think, but organizational changes, they do not happen overnight. So it's yeah, that's probably like the hardest part of the things that you want to implement. Like if you want to implement a tool, it can be much easier to do, and like then you need to justify the cost. And when you want to implement organizational change, well, that may take years or never, unless you don't agree with me.
I really like that point, right? But I think there's another data point, so to speak, that in my mind shows how we're actually now moving in that direction more. So one of the things that I found amazing is how much team topologies now has been mentioned, right? Like the brand name team topologies is just so blew up so big. And I think I really like it. I don't want to say anything bad about it, but the point is more that I think they really captured this phase where people realized that, oh yeah, we probably need to organize things differently. We cannot just hope that sprawl doesn't happen. But when we organize things, right, when we do organizational changes, how do we do that? And then team topologies comes in with a nice answer, and they actually give you a good recipe how to put in a platform team and have stream-aligned teams that work in cooperation with that platform team, right? So, and I think we're now at that stage where organizations are realizing that, yeah, we cannot just put in like some technical solution and everything will be fine. We actually have to make sure that the teams work in line with what we want to achieve, right? We want to have a platform that allows us to govern, and we want to have teams that work supported by that platform. How do we do that? Well, we need to make sure that we have those actual teams. And that success of team topologies to me really was mostly a sign that this is now happening, right? And they're like capitalizing on that in a really, really great way. I mean, it's wonderful to see that. But I think they just came in just at the right time, right? Like we understood that, yes, organizational change is hard, but we need it. And I think that's one of the reasons why it succeeds in such a mind-blowing way.
And do you think it might be like, maybe Antoine, since you kind of built, the team, the tech team from the ground up, do you think it's like easier to implement the practices, like good practices, when it's like from the ground up, rather than change it like, too late in the cycle?
So I was never confronted to a situation where I have to change afterwards, but indeed I can assert that today you have the means to build that properly in a small organization. Well, when you're building an organization and a tech stack from scratch, it's way easier to do that properly, especially, for example, with new technologies like GraphQL and so on. You can build federated APIs very easily. So yeah, in a startup like Escape, I can definitely say that it looks pretty simple to avoid that problem. And in practice, when I discuss with some of our partners or customers, we see that the biggest mess comes from merging and acquisition. When there are a company buying another one, there are different processes, there are multiple, there are different cultures. in the way they manage APIs and so on. And in that case, this is extremely challenging to make everything converging towards a single source of truth, I would say. And actually, at my level, I don't have the precise solution for them. But yeah, that's to answer the question. That's easier when you build that from the ground, definitely.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And what like solutions would you recommend? Because Bill already spoke about some of the potential like solutions how to mitigate.
I definitely think that the first thing to do, obviously, and Bill also mentioned that, is to catalog or inventory all the endpoints that you can have in your organizations. And as I said, when they are merging and acquisition, but not only in that case, you can have APIs so that are internal, external, and behind multiple different domain names and so on. So it becomes quite challenging to find them. And actually, so I'm a bit biased here because this is one of the challenges we try to solve at Escape. We are building a solution for that, of course. But so I can see every day every different cases and every different topologies of organizations that have that kind of problems. But definitely the governance, the inventory of the APIs will be the first thing to do. Then indeed, I would say that having a dev-centric approach, when you know all the APIs you have exposed, having a dev-centric approach could be fine too with, for example, federated API management. So I talk about Geographical, which is built for that purpose, but you also have the other solutions such as putting all your APIs behind a gateway or something like this. Of course, this allows you to involve the developers into this governance and security process. And the last point will be to focus on security here. So of course, testing the APIs, protecting them against the different security threats, especially OS top 10, is also quintessential. And this could be done, for example, through gateways. This is one of the solutions, or through sidecar agents. This is runtime protection. So this will be the three steps. First, inventorying, then having a dev-centric approach, and then focusing on security.
Yeah, and like Bill and Eric, what do you think is like the hardest part of actually, evangelizing the solutions? Because if you want to, spread the knowledge to the bigger public, it's hard, right? And what would be the steps for that, especially with the years of experience on this topic?
Well, I think you might be evangelizing it either from the top down or from the bottom up, right? If you're trying to convince leadership that we need more like standards around our APIs, I would probably point them to all the terrible breaches that have happened and all the money these companies have had to pay due to security vulnerabilities against, unauthorized endpoints and unauthenticated endpoints that are just sitting out there. I think that is a good case to make. And then some of the cost saving benefits and reusability benefits that I previously mentioned, I would probably use that within an argument. And really, I think it works from the top down too, but you might be faced with intransigence internally based on the history with mergers and acquisitions, as Antoine rightfully said. That makes a lot of sense. I think companies are coming from different backgrounds entirely, and at least convincing them that, hey, we need a standardized framework or governance policy that is a strategy. We can implement it maybe with this middleware you're talking about, some sort of API gateway or federated approach. Yes, that could be used. I think setting first what the strategy is will be helpful, and then matching the technology to achieve that. Curious to know what you think too, Eric.
Well, sometimes it's also funding stuff is really like one of the things that I've seen in particular in larger organizations. So for example, one really large German organization I worked with, I mean, they had this funny thing to me where they had, like, I think from the CIO or some really, really high level leadership, they had this basically like the Amazon Bezos mandate, right? That said everything that we build will have an API, right? Just as kind of a aspirational statement. And then you looked at what happened in the organization, and pretty much nothing they built had an API. And that was really because, I mean, nobody thought through, well, it would be nice if that was the case, but what is the strategy to actually make that happen? Right? Just saying that is like purely aspirational, and not then thinking, okay, you know, in order to make that happen, we need to explain what that means. We need to teach people how to do it. We need to provide them with the right support to actually get it done, ideally even build a platform. And all these things need to be funded somehow. And in particular, in larger organizations, right, you have a lot of business units that do their own stuff. And if you don't have like a real leadership driven strategy and funding to actually make that happen, right? Like oftentimes I think things also just like it just kind of disintegrates into these little kingdoms where people just do whatever works for them right now. And then there really is no coherent way, and some people don't do it at all because doesn't seem that necessary for them, right? And some, I mean, some of these organizations, we just had somebody from Siemens here, right? And I mean, just the size of these. So Siemens has 70,000 software developers, right? Just software developers, 70,000. So imagine, right? Like, how do you get 70,000 software developers to do what you want? Right? That's pretty big challenge, right? And and it takes, among other things, of course, right? But it also takes just funding and time. And when you look into, for example, that good old story from the Bezos, the Amazon API mandate, right? There's that story of, hey, this is what Jeff Bezos said. And then there's this other story that basically then 2 years later reports from all the expensive and painful stuff that happened afterwards, right? It's like, well, the leader wanted that, and this is what it took to make it happen. And I think that gap between this idea of, yes, we should govern, right? Like everybody would say, yeah, we should really govern. That sounds like a good idea, right? Who would say, no, we want API anarchy. That is what we really want. But then thinking through, what does it take, right? And what do we need to fund to actually make that happen? That oftentimes like falls in this weird twilight zone between like funding individual development teams and then having just purely aspirational statements. And this will be my last plug, but this is, for example, one thing where I really like team topologies, right? Because they specifically say there should be platform teams and they are necessary, and they are the ones who actually pick up the work that should be supporting the stream-aligned teams, right? And I think if you don't go in with that mindset and also think about what are the things that I need to fund for this to actually work, then you end up with these ideas of, yes, we should have better governance, but not a working strategy how to actually put that in place.
I think Erik's right. I mean, we talk big about API first strategies and how everyone is doing it, but I don't think that's really the case. An API community is but a subsection of the larger tech community, right? And not everyone is thinking about this all the time. We are, because we're very investigated and or invested in this. But some other larger trends out there are things like the platform engineering movement. I think that's related to what Erik is discussing with like team topologies and investing in platform teams. I think riding on those coattails could give APIs an advantage of being governed, kind of using that as a case study to be like, hey, we're already doing this platform stuff. Let's consider API governance as part of that.
Interesting. And do you think, like in each organization or in each team, like each team that you create that collaborate with each other, you need kind of like API champion, because we talk, like in a security field, we talk about like a concept, of security champion. So I'm actually curious, like, would it work if we would have actually someone on a team who would kind of promote APIs and actually be responsible for their governance and responsible for best practices, documentation, and do you think it's like the concept that we maybe should focus on more?
I mean, for a while, somehow that disappeared at least, and I'm curious what you think, Bill. But for a while, it seemed that everybody was talking about the Spotify model, right, where they had these API guilds or chapters. I always get these confused, but whatever. Like that, they had this idea, like what you said, Alexandra, of kind of these cross-cutting structures, right, where you have the teams, and then you have certain capabilities that get embedded into the teams through these kind of cross-cutting structures. And for a while, that seemed to be something that everybody is talking about all the time, like the Spotify model. Somehow that has completely disappeared. I don't know what happened, Bill.
You're talking about like the paved road kind of illusion?
Well, I mean, they had this image, right, of this is how we structure our teams, and they had basically the stream-aligned teams, right, like we call them today, and then here's how we have, and I always get this wrong, like chapters or guilds of how we are embedding, like Alexandra just said, like API knowledge or API champions into each of those teams, so that there is somebody who would say, wait a minute, right? Like if we have an API, we should probably secure that, right?
Yeah.
And
I still think it's a cool model, and I've seen other people refer to this as like a API center of enablement or something, or center for excellence, and then people from that group will insert themselves as like advocates or advisors into like different development teams. I need more case studies on that to have a better opinion, honestly. It sounds interesting, and it might come down to what Erik was talking about earlier with cost decisions, and just if the organization is prepared to invest in another role to be that sort of API champion internally. I think it's a cool idea, and organizations could benefit from it. We already do that when we have public-facing services, right? Like there's an API developer advocate for an API as a product company. That's very common. Well, if you're in a large organization managing with 70,000 developers with perhaps 1,000 endpoints out there, having some internal guidance and an internal facing lead that understands this and is dedicated to improving those best practices, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Talking about the organization and structure of teams, we're also seeing the same trend with security people, I guess. Originally, the traditional model for security is having the engineering team, the development teams on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have the security people who are under the silos. But with the AppSec trend, we are seeing more and more companies that are breaking the silos between security and development and engineering, and so we are seeing more and more AppSec roles of people who are actually working within, under the hierarchy of the size of the company, but within the engineering team. So there is evangelism for security too. So that's a really interesting trend we can see in modern companies. And it really helps developing a security mindset in whole teams at all the level of the company. It develops shared goals. It's also to develop shared goals too between the security people and the dev people. And I guess this is a very interesting trend that is happening right now. I'm not sure all companies are adopting that, especially in France. It's still very siloed, but in modern US companies, we can see that more and more, and that interesting shift left trend actually.
Yeah.
Do you think, do you see the trend between that's different, between the US, between Austria, Germany, Switzerland, I guess, in terms of API governance as well, or with people, based on people with whom you talked, some case studies?
Oh, that's interesting. So is there a geographical kind of difference of opinion?
Maybe.
Erik, do you have any ideas on that one?
I was hoping I wouldn't be asked to answer that question. No, it's a really good question. I was just trying to that's an interesting question, right? So you would think that maybe traditionally a little bit more hierarchical cultures, I don't know, like Germany and France, right? Like that those actually might have actually an easier time with that, right? Because they are used to like organizing things well, and everybody is used to following orders and these kind of things. I don't know. I really don't know. To be honest, I lack the insight into enough companies to really kind of have enough data to make but that actually would be super interesting. It would
be. I think a lot of the API best practices that at least we're sharing on the Nordic APIs blog and that like I'm disseminating in other publications, it seems pretty universal, pretty international. I think the areas where you're going to come into some differences of opinion have to do with the regulated sectors, such as healthcare, banking. Yeah, that's going to influence your API design strategy and what kind of data you allow to be shared publicly. And even sometimes if documentation is allowed to be shared. And a whole other range of considerations. So yeah, regulation and maybe regulated countries could affect the API mindset for sure. Some are more open than others, and in the EU, there's this thing called open banking. That's not a thing in the US. It's more on the private companies themselves, whether or not they're going to open that sort of user data for third-party providers. Of course, there's regulations on data privacy and such, but nothing's being like mandated in an open data sort of format as it is out there. So that did influence a lot of API development. Another thing in the US, I'd say San Francisco is sort of leading the charge on AI, and the Silicon Valley movement there is pretty active. Of course, it's an international thing, but just thinking offhand, there's a lot of interest in AI there, which is, I think, very intrinsically related to API development. They sort of go hand in hand.
Like, in what sense do you think it's going to be more like related within upcoming years? For example, AI that's going to, I don't know, automatically recognize API in the development process and document it, or like how do you see this trend evolving?
I see it kind of on both sides, right? AI helping the API designers themselves, but AI also helping the developers who are consuming these APIs. I think we need another fireside chat just to explore
for the AI.
AI
just for AI stuff.
Relationship with APIs.
Yeah, for sure.
But
But
actually,
it's
I mean,
interesting.
It doesn't seem very. Yeah, it does. I mean, it doesn't seem very far-fetched to think that you might have an IDE that would just say, well, like good old Clippy, from the Clippy days. I see you're exposing an API. Do you want to have some help with securing it, right?
You want an open API.
Yeah, I see you're causing. You're just causing damages of billions of dollars. Maybe you want to secure that. So I don't know whether I mean, technically I would say you could totally do that, but that would depend on all the developers using the same IDE or checking into the same repo. But there may be some things that actually help with that kind of aspect. I haven't even thought about that so far, but where you would just look at basically code analysis and be a little bit smarter in terms of, and maybe Antoine, I don't know, have you looked into that or considered that, like looking into how could you prevent those things from even happening?
That's a good question. I still don't know. I have to think more about it to answer the question.
Okay, let's talk about it next week.
Yeah.
So it means no.
Perfect.
Yeah.
But it's a good line of thinking. I mean, who knows? Like with secrets or things like that were exposed. Now you have kind of a possibility, and I think initially, like eventually, it can be also like a detection, as you said, like a Clippy in old Microsoft. So I think there are multiple possibilities that are endless. Like just within the last year, there's so many tools and development that was happening. In the space. So who knows what's it gonna look like just in a year from now, and I think we'll see of what we can potentially do with the AI. As actually maybe detecting
Yeah.
APIs like being exposed already in the development and
Yeah. Of course.
maybe in
Okay. So
where it's located.
we're working a lot on that, and I guess we are writing a paper about that. So maybe
Okay.
I will share you
Yeah.
the white paper. It would be maybe more or the article with all those details. There are a lot of things indeed to use AI to detect endpoints, and this is an active research topic at Escape. So and we have very promising results. So I guess I won't.
But it's kind of going both ways, right? I mean, you could also, I mean, currently when you look at like Copilot and all these things, right, that's kind of going the opposite direction where, people just say, I want to do this. And then you just like get a bunch of code generated and who knows what that does, right? Like it might be doing all kinds of stupid things because other people were doing stupid things before. Yay, let's do the same. And, right. So it also kind of, there's that risk. But then again, you might be able to kind of mitigate that or kind of compensate for that by then having another AI looking at that and saying, no, not that.
Of course, in that case, you have of course you have testing solutions that can try to generate legitimate attacks and build traffic on APIs. So this is what you are building, and you have also runtime protection. So here you're releasing the inbound traffic, as it was mentioned by the comments. And here you're trying to block the requests in real time or just to raise an alert on the potential malicious attacks that are going on. And here AI is very smart in detecting the attack chain scenarios and the patterns. It's not just analyzing one request, but analyzing a sequence of requests that could lead to a potential attack. So maybe in a sequence of requests that could lead in a security issue, you have some of those requests that seem to be legit, but the problem are not the request individually, but the sequence itself, which is very hard to detect without AI.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of areas where API providers could benefit from generative AI. I think the runtime analysis situation that you're describing is definitely one of them. If you have, events and logs for a large language model to analyze, I think it could potentially flag a lot of issues. There's also the possibility for API discovery, having one of these models look at a wide range of code repositories to help you catalog your APIs. Another area would be generating API contracts and specifications, more on like the description side of these services. I also see it benefiting the consumer too through like code generation. So automating how we construct our API requests. There's this one example of this already in practice. It's on the Plaid API, and there's like this little AI assistant called Bill, ironically, and it's just like this. They brand it as this duck that like analyzes our API documentation for fun, and so you can chat at it natural language questions, and then it'll just generate the API response, the request that you need in your language of choice. I think that's more trustworthy than relying on a public LLM like a chat GPT, because if it's being trained on the internal assets of the software provider, it's more likely not to hallucinate and give you incorrect information or potentially suggest code and such. So all that stuff could improve the developer experience, I think, with API integration.
Yeah, For sure. I think we're almost like towards the end of our time. I think there was there was a question in the beginning that we can potentially address. So I'm not sure who would like to address that. I guess it's
Okay.
both for you, Erik, and Antoine. So I don't know who
Yeah,
wants to start.
I started a little with that. So actually, we are currently working on indeed revolutionary, I would say, runtime protection model built upon AI. So I will let you know more about that when everything gets ready. So this is how we are going to handle that at Escape.
Okay.
I don't know for you,
Yeah. So I
Erik.
don't know
Does the
what Escape
question
is
make
doing.
sense?
Kind of. I'll just give it a brief try, right? So I mean, from the OpenAPI perspective, if you have an API that's specified in OpenAPI, then it does have some. If you talk about like incoming of your users, right? So you basically, that seems to talk about validating requests that are issued against the API. And I mean, a simple kind of tooling that you can use that is not used a lot, I would say, nowadays, is just that you do runtime checks against the schema, right? That you basically validate anything that's incoming, and if it doesn't fit the schema that you're expecting, then you're rejecting it, right? You're not even processing that. You basically say this doesn't look like something that I should be processing. And there's tooling now. There's a kind of a new class of API tools that come out, which a lot of people refer to as fuzzers, so API fuzzing, right? And those tools, basically what they do is you point them at an API, you give them the OpenAPI description, and they send valid requests that conform to the schema, and they also kind of put in like additional properties here and there, and they actually consciously violate the schema, right? And then see how does the API behave. And if the API isn't rejecting those things, that, for example, could mean that you don't pass this test, right? So if you in quality control basically would say, hey, we're fuzzing every API before it goes to production, you could more easily flag APIs that are accepting requests that they should not be accepting. So that, I mean, it's not catching all the things it should be catching, but at least it's an interesting, I would say, new class of tools that have appeared not so long ago that not just test functionality, but also test against that behavior that potentially could be a security issue.
So far, thanks a lot, Erik, Bill, and Antoine, for being here on live. So I was very excited to have that conversation with you, and I think I learned a lot of different things and use cases, I think, as well. So I'm definitely going to look up like the Spotify use case because I didn't know about it before. So it's great to read about it. So thanks so much.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Thank you.
Have us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody